Welcome and welcome back to the Marketing Made Inclusive podcast. Today, we are joined by one of my internet faves. I know you're my real life fave, but I look forward to the SEO tweets and the chit. Like, I get all the banter. It's not even banter, like it's serious. But, anyways, I figure out what's going on in the SEO and that world on Twitter from you and two other people, and you're one of my faves. Hi, Azeem. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, that is a wonderful introduction. Thank you very, very much. And I'm certainly feeling the pressure now.
Well, tell the people a little about yourself and yeah, why you're probably I've given it away now, but yeah, what you do in marketing.
So yeah, look, I'm Azeem Ahmad, better known online or in some spaces as Azeem Digital, purely because people have difficulty spelling my last name, which is another podcast for another day. I work as a digital marketing lead in-house in the B2B and manufacturing, industrial manufacturing sector, I should add. I do host my own podcast, of which you were a wonderful guest, Joyann. It's called the Azeem Digital Asks podcast. Please check it out.
Links will be in the description.
Bing! It's important for me to mention that my podcast, I prioritize typically people from marginalized groups, so women, people of color. I've had people in the past who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. I thought there's a big gap in the marketing podcast space for a podcast like that, so I created it. And then other than that, I also do conference speaking, fortunately, internationally now. People don't shout about their own successes a lot. So I'm going to very briefly say that I did a conference last year in Barcelona, international, people from over 30 countries were there. My talk was voted talk of the conference.
Love it.
The listeners I just dabbed, which is like 10 years old, shows my age there. But yeah, I mean, I'm very, very pleased to have got myself into a position where wonderful people like yourself are looking out for things that I've got to say, and different opinions on marketing. And I'm really, really looking forward to being a part of your podcast. I know you mentioned when we got together that you were thinking about doing this. So on recording, I'm going to say a massive, massive congratulations for getting it off the ground. And I will absolutely be shouting about this from every digital rooftop that I can think of.
Thank you so much. You're definitely a huge inspiration. And I love that you say you prioritize individuals from marginalized backgrounds, because I remember when you first started, I think I met you through Noise Little Monkey, and we were talking about the diversity in the marketing sector.
Yeah.
And I saw the podcast. I started to notice that you were doing it, but you didn't say it until I think like a few more episodes. And I'm just like, I like this. I like the action first part, which I feel like so many brands do it the other way. They talk about doing it and then don't do anything.
Yeah.
But yes, we're going to dive into inclusive marketing. But first of all, I'd love to know, what does inclusive marketing mean to you?
Right, I'm going to give you the answer. It's not like 7 hours long. But for me, the obvious answer would be, marketing that includes everybody, hence the first part of the word inclusive, right? And typically, whenever I speak about things like this, it always comes down to the wider topic of like diversity and inclusion. So it's anything for me that would consider including people from all groups of society, including but not limited to people with a disability, for example, or people of a certain age, people of a certain or no gender, and even people from different, for example, economic backgrounds. Basically, the short version is inclusive marketing is a form of marketing that is considerate and includes every potential group of people, or speaks to, I should say, every potential group of people that there is.
Okay. My follow-up question to your definition, because it's something I've been saying recently, is yes, but when you sprinkle the marketing on it, would you say sometimes exclusion is okay in the marketing context?
Well, I would need some more some more context on that. It's probably something that we can pick up later on in the episode, because it's definitely something that I want to discuss. But I think giving a more broader brush answer, in some contexts, exclusion potentially is absolutely fine. So let's go with something really obvious. For example, tampons or period products, for example. In that instance, it's absolutely fine to exclude men, because that's something that they're never going to need. Absolutely fine. I'm not here saying if you are advertising tampons, or if you have a client that advertises tampons, immediately now start targeting men. Absolutely not. But in that instance, and in certain instances like that, I would say yes. In some cases, exclusion is fine. I think it's also important for me to very quickly say, parts of this area, obviously I've got an interest in this, as you well know, and hopefully as your listeners and viewers will too. But I think it's a constant learning process, and I will make mistakes along the way. You might have noticed, or you might not have, but now that I have mentioned it, you're definitely going to go back and check. When I talked about earlier and I mentioned people with disabilities, that's something that I've literally just learned about this week, that using the phrase disabled people is not inclusive language, and you should say people with disabilities. That's something I've literally just learned. So there might be similar mistakes like that on the way, but just know it's learning.
This is one that I there's a certain marketer I want to get on here who runs an agency focusing on disability representation in campaigns. However, on my own research, I am not a physical disabled individual, so this is my own opinion. It's divided on whether with disabilities or disabled person. And I think on a one-to-one basis, the individual would like to decide. Like some people in any other aspects would prefer to be called their ethnicity or black or brown or da 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 da. But the debate that I've seen within the disabled community is that with disabilities, in a persona creation aspect in terms of marketing, separates the disability from the person. And then you're thinking, oh, well, we can just forget that because they are with it and we can think of them as this. But there are other people within the disabled community that are just very much, no, that is part of me and it cannot be removed. But it's so interesting because when you're thinking about language and written copy and spoken word, there's so, like, I'm sure the person that told you that was talking in regards to, you know, talking to them and that conversation.
Yeah.
And then when I see it in written copy, I'm just like, ooh, but who are you actually talking? There's something to question there when they're describing someone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough one. But yeah, like you said, I think you've probably phrased it in the best way. It's probably better to let the individual make a decision on it.
But I do think you make a valid point. No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's very similar to one that I'm probably more comfortable talking about, where we talk about BAME or PLC. Again, we can probably get into this later in the episode. Personally, many years ago, I was BAME, BAME, BAME all the time. But having seen the impacts and being told the impacts of just shoving everybody into this box, and now obviously use POC or person of color or marginalized groups separately. I've been doing some research for a conference talk actually that I'm doing soon, and even I think it was minorities is probably not terms that you should be using. It should be, I've always used marginalized groups. I've literally got a newsletter called The Marginalized Marketer, but there are some terms that I've been learning where I've just thought, well, I didn't realize that this is not probably a term that people should reconsider. And I always think, this is me just waffling on now, so shut me up. I always think I am someone, much like yourself, who has an active interest in this area. So I am interested in it, and I didn't know about certain things that I probably should be reconsidering. I often find my mind wandering and thinking, there are people who aren't interested, who are still using these terms quite freely, and are completely none the wiser for it. So it's not easy, but with
It's a
resources
journey.
like this, like you said, it's a journey. Yeah.
It's a full journey because even with, and if anyone dives into my history, I literally founded a group called a BME Collective, which was a social group. And it's funny because I always say with my past, I moved here with my mother, and that's when I found out I was Black. I have a very different perspective on the Black British experience because in my head, I go back to Trinidad and I'm just a Trinidadian. Like there's no hyphen, there's no other. Um, so I've not fully wrapped my head around it, which in some ways has been beneficial to what I do now. But I remember when we created the group, we first call it Black Social. And then we were at a gathering and we saw one of our members who was Black themselves stumbles in saying it. They felt uncomfortable saying the group was called a Black Social. So we
Mhm.
renamed it to the BME Collective and everyone was just like, yeah, BME Collective, BME Collective. And now I'm no longer running the group, but I look back at the social group and I'm just like, I'm not a huge fan of that name, but it's outside of my control now. But at the same time, I changed the name to make the people who were part of the group comfortable. So if they are comfortable, me not being comfortable as a marketer is a separate thing. It's such a weird balancing act. And also you mentioned about, marginalized group, underrepresented. I was questioned recently when I was talking to a client. I said, oh, you're a representation of Black and brown individuals. And they were like, don't you mean people of color? I'm like, no, for you as a client, because I know if I say people of color to this particular client, they're going to think Latinx and really light skin. And
Yeah.
I'm specifically saying Black and brown because of your physical representation of those individuals. If I say POC, you're going to find the like person with the slightest amount of seasoning.
Yeah. See,
It's just like, their great 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 grandparent was like, I don't know, Spanish or something. And they're like, yes, we've done our bit. I'm like, no, no, this is a stock photo. People can't tell that person's great grandparent. They can't work it out. Like, oh gosh, how has it been? Because you've been doing the podcast and this conversation, especially publicly, a lot longer than I have. And I'm just curious to know when you're talking to people about the actual representation in workplaces, what is the kind of responses you're getting? What is the vibe in the world?
I've still got a great story to tell you for this one. It's probably one you've heard me say when we've been on a webinar together in the past, but I think it'd be great for your listeners and viewers. By the way, if you're listening, you can also watch this, I'm told, so please go and check it out. Free promotion. But yeah, back to the point. Some years ago, I went into an organization externally just to have a nose around and give an external point of view. And I vividly remember walked into meeting room, various senior level executives and stuff there. I got access to a lot of information from the company. And one of the very first questions was, so Azeem, what do you notice about us? And my first response was words to the effect of, well, I've noticed that you're all of a certain age, an older age group, and that you're all white. And they were quite taken aback like this. And they were literally just like, as if it was an offensive thing to say. And I said, it's nothing to feel bad about, but the point of the matter is you are marketing to an audience that is not all of an older age or of white or who lives in a certain geographic or from a certain demographic. You don't appear as if you are speaking to the people who you're trying to represent. If I was your target audience, I would look at you and I would say, I don't see myself represented here. I'm not going to engage with this business or this service or buy this product from you. And they were like, oh, well, there was a minute or so and they were quite taken aback. And then I genuinely thought something was going to change, but they basically said, well, what you might not know is, I'm just going to make up a name. We had Deborah, and Deborah left us last month. And Deborah was a woman, and she was 31. So what they didn't say was she ticked all the boxes, but they intimated that. I said, Deborah was a woman, she was Black, she was 31, but unfortunately we lost her, which affected the makeup of the board. They may as well have said, she was our quota. But but it's one of those things like well, actually, in fact, it's not one of those things. That's a lie, and I shouldn't really say that. And I'm glad that's on recording, because now I've completely just checked myself on document. I don't think it's one of those things, because it's a frustration. I mean, I'm sidetracking here, but like I said, I was doing some research for a conference talk that I was doing, and I was looking into things like, for example, pay.
Mhm.
Pay is something that's been quite big at the moment. And literally, it's almost as if having a different skin color immediately means you're going to be financially penalized.
Mhm.
We all bleed the same blood, effectively, don't we? And in some cases, it's a disadvantage. So back to that point where I was talking about not being represented or whatever, I often, and it is often, and I'm not sure if you feel the same, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but sometimes, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to do like conference speaking for a while, and I've been all over the place. I'm very fortunate to be in Europe again twice over the next few weeks. I'm really looking forward to it. But sometimes I take a step back and I think, are they picking me because of the color of my skin, or the quality of my thoughts and research and feedback? And I have that doubt, or imposter syndrome. I have that moment where I think, I'm not quite sure here. I'm definitely not the only person of color, like on a lineup, for example. In some cases, I have been, and then
Mhm.
I think, okay, maybe are they just ticking a box, or have they seen me before? Do they like what they're saying? But the wider point that I'm making is, I'm someone who has done this a lot over the past few years, and probably this is the first time I'm sharing this on a podcast. Sometimes I think, are they just picking me because I might tick a metaphorical box for them, or is there genuinely something that they've seen in the past that they think I will provide value to their audience?
Mhm.
For you, I know it's the latter. You've reached out to me and you've said, this is why I want you on the podcast. And hopefully we're having a really good discussion about this, which your audience will love. But like I said, yeah, sometimes I just think, I don't know if you feel the same sometimes, but I just think,
It's
what's the
it's
motivation?
I have had the same challenge, and I have struggled when telling people to venture into what I do. I feel obligated to warn them that sometimes it literally feels dirty.
Mm,
Like, there has been rare occasions. I think the occasions where it hasn't felt like that is where I've had to like apply, and I've had to, I don't know. The example I use is, there was a conference in Bristol. I missed the application deadline, and I was like, let me chuck in a talk. And then they like, yes, come. It was like a week before. And I'm just like, why did they say? And then I saw the speaker lineup and I'm like, this is big for me to be on this conference. But at the
mm,
same time, you didn't have any speakers of color, like none. And then
yeah.
I have the flip experience where I did digital gaggle with Noisy Little Monkey. And they asked me to speak, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited. But they also had like 3 conversations with me about, hey, this is how our conference is, this is our audience. What are you planning to say? What is your talk? Have you like, they vetted me for their audience, and that felt
Yeah.
genuine, because it felt like, hey, yes, you may need someone, but if I'm shit, you're not gonna have me.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
but whenever I'm talking to people about like going in, especially Black women, I'm like, sometimes I have somewhat accepted, and it feels weird saying this on the podcast, but I've accepted that sometimes I'm selling my Blackness or I'm selling my womanness. And
Mm,
there's a balancing act in that, because through some of the work I do, I see my counterpart, a white male marketing person who, for example, I'm not downplaying or saying ADHD isn't a learning disorder, learning difficulty, but they find that they have ADHD, and all of a sudden they're applying for everything that has disability attached to it. They're going
mm,
for every application award. There's no shyness. And this
mm,
is the one thing. And I'm just like, if they're milking it and they already have all the privileges in the world, why am I beating myself up for milking it for myself? Because this is a disadvantage in other occasions. But it's a continuous, and it's almost a situation to situation thing where I'm just like, am I happy if I find out in this scenario that I am the only person of color, the only woman, will I be comfortable with that? And if it's not, it very rarely is a yes, but I try and see if I can bring someone else in to, it is giving them an opportunity. This is the bit where it sounds a bit weird, but it's making me feel better as well.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense. And already from what you've been saying there, I already think that's several steps ahead of where someone in a privileged position would be. Because I don't think they have that. I'm broad brush again, but a large percentage of that group of people will not have that awareness of the privilege. The percentage that do very likely will do exactly as you mentioned, put their name forward for everything. So
I have seen some things.
haven't we all?
Seen some things, but in terms of the public speaking aspect of it, I remember I did a conference and someone came up to me afterwards and literally was just like, "Yeah, I tried to put colored people on my website and it didn't work." And I was just like, "It's because you know when you see that everything you said did not go in, and you're like, you are a bigger problem as a person." And my friend's like, "Oh, did you correct her? Did you?" I was just like, I wasn't in a position, I'm in front of like 400 people to try and fix this person. But at the same time, I'm just like, that's what she took away from my talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it is a balancing act. I mean, I was literally just thinking, you mentioned like about conference speaking. I think it was a couple of years ago. I was at Brighton SEO, a very, very, if not the most popular conference in the UK. And literally, it's a few days event, and over the course of the same event, like completely two contrasting things happen. I was in the queue waiting for a coffee. I'd already done my talk at this time, so I'm in the queue waiting for a coffee in one of the breaks. And I just had a guy come up to me, Asian guy, a very strong accent, and he was just like, "Hello, I want a job." And I was like, "Okay, I'm certainly not employing at the moment." I was like, "What do you mean?" He was like, "Oh, I need a job." And I was like, "Okay, what have you done already? What are you doing?" Like, I was genuinely interested to help him, and he was just like, "I'm here." And I was like, just automatically being at a conference doesn't mean that you're going to get a job. I was like, you're going to have to put the work in, you're going to have to network and whatever. And I was like, look, things don't just automatically happen. And he's like, oh, I think he mentioned he was from India. So automatically I knew there was going to be some sort of language or like cultural barrier. I'm not Indian. I don't have Indian family, but I know, having family from the country next door, that sometimes there is that barrier there, and there's a certain expectation of just being somewhere will get you something. But that's not the case over here for sure. So I explained to him, I said, look, if you spoke to likely anybody else, they would like tell you to go on, Slingy Hook, do one, what are you talking about? I explained to him in the whole coffee break, I was talking to this guy and I was like, look, you can't just expect for something to happen to you. Like you're going to have to put the work in. And I was quite frank, and I said to him, I'll be honest, you're going to have to put double, 3 or 4 times the amount of work in as other people in this very building right now. And he was like, well, what do you mean? And I told him, he was like, right, okay, I didn't think of it like that. So I put him in touch with a couple of people. I said, come on, put a bit of the work in and the reward will come to you after. So there's that. There's that person who came, that expectation of just talking to me will make something happen. And by the way, during my book, I never once intimated that I'm hiring or I'm looking for people or whatever, anything else. All he took away was the fact that he was looking for a job. Anyway, separately in that same event, a guy comes over to me, another guy who lives in India, and he's quite well known in like the Indian SEO community. Came up to me, he's like, "Oh, Azeem, lovely to meet you. We've spoken on Twitter a few times," and then I recognized who he was from his image, and that he was like, "I came over here to see you, just to see you," and I was like, "No," I was laughing at first because I couldn't believe it. I was like, "This is me you're talking about." And he was telling me about how he went about saving, or didn't say anything, just saving up his money, researching hotels and everything else, and built his itinerary for the event around when I was going to be talking. And he was like, yeah, I came to see you. He wanted to take a picture with me and everything. And I was like, I'm literally just a normal guy. And he was like, no, this will mean a lot to me, blah, blah. It's like, there's a big Indian SEO community who like sees what you're doing, really interested in it, and he was like, so many more of the community wanted to come over to the UK, but were having issues with visas and stuff. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
that's like incredible. I couldn't believe that someone had come from India. I didn't even know he was even in the audience. Comes over and he's like, "Yeah, we've spoken a couple of times, but I made a point to come and see you." I was like, "That's incredible." Something like that is like literally life changing, because I still remember it now. It was a couple of years ago. I
Mm-hmm.
remember having a conversation with that group of people, with the person who sort of looks after that group of people. I said, "Listen, we were talking about visa issues, and that's another conversation for another day. But in short, when you're in a different country and you're trying to get a visa for the UK, to call here will cost you an arm and a leg, unless you're already in the UK, in which case the call is free.
Mm-hmm.
And most often than not, you'll get through to an automated line which tells you to wait. So you've paid for nothing." I said, "Just let me know, and as long as I'm free and not working, in my spare time, I'm happy to just call up, give me an application number. I'm more than happy to help you. I don't want anything in return from you, but me being able to help and enable other people to like physically come over here and experience marketing, networking, conferences. Absolutely, it's a win-win."
Mm-hmm.
Go back to the point about mindset earlier on. I think my mindset is, I recognize I'm a person of color and I'm in a good position now within the industry, but my immediate thought is, how can I create more people like,
Yep.
or who will do even better than me or go even further than me? Because ultimately we're only here for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm more interested in seeing the next Azeem, or I'm more interested in putting someone further ahead of me so I can look at and think, right, that's an aspiration for me. But there are others who think, I've got this, I've earned this,
I have to
this
be the
is
only one.
my box, my table, and nobody else is getting involved. This is me. I've built this all myself. I'm thinking, I want to share this with as many people as I can. That feeling that I got from that guy was incredible. I want to share that feeling inside me with more people, because the more people have that feeling, I think the better the marketing industry will be.
And a better, like, even the people who want to be the only one doesn't make sense when you know what marketing is. It's like you're supposed to have exposure to your audience. You're supposed to be able to learn and engage. So if you're not letting other people in and you're answering all the questions, you're being a bad marketer, just flat
Yeah.
out, because you're not investing in that. And I think that's so amazing. You that like getting that direct role model feedback essentially. Because you hear, like, I don't know if you have it. Sometimes people say, "Oh, you're a role model." I'm just like, ugh. But when you see something or you see the change, you're just like, okay, this is why I don't, and I agree with you 100%. I am fed up of being the only one,
Mm.
and I don't want to. And I'm good. I'm just like, okay, it does nothing for me to know I was the only one in this room or whatever. I'm just like, okay. It just means I'm gonna have to take on twice the amount of work, such as a Black woman answering questions about my hair rather than my business. Uh,
Mm.
I don't want to do that. I don't want to educate y'all. I want to talk about marketing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So work-wise, I just love, like, literally, I'm just imagining a bunch of Azeems in India right now. Just
With extremely shiny heads.
they're just ready. They're creating their content. They're ready to come over here. That was the thing that came up to my mind, and there's a conversation I have a lot with some of my American friends. In regards to the first gentleman that spoke to you, it's so fascinating how England is marketed externally.
Mm.
And I still say it's terrible, the history of England, but as a country, England and America are some of the best marketers.
Mm.
And I'm just like, there's so many conversations I have with people. I'm like, it's not like that here. Like, a tangent, but our government put out a report saying that it wasn't racist. Like, that report was not for the people in this country. It was for everyone else outside. And then they're
Yeah.
telling them not to come. And I'm just like, do you guys not understand your messaging? Do you?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, depending on when this goes out, like you'll see in the news recently, the entire focus is all on immigration at the moment, as if there's some kind of horrendous immigration problem and horrific language being used, to contrast with those reports. And it just makes you think. I often wonder, and I should do it more, I should talk to other people outside of the UK about non-marketing things and just say, what do you think it's like over in the UK? Like, what's it like? There was a separate, to bring it back to marketing, there was a separate conversation that I was having recently online about, you mentioned about the UK and the US, but I think they operate in largely, not wholly, but largely very independently of one another. If I think about events, networking events, for example, it's very rare that you will see or hear of people going from the UK to the US for an event, unless obviously it's funded by the company or the event that they're going to. But you will see and hear more of people from the US coming to the UK for events. And I think that's largely down to the fact that compensation salaries are much higher in the US. I was doing a bit of digging, having a conversation about it. It was very professional and polite. The conversation was, why are there not more marketing events in the US? And then I had a look. One very recently happened. I think the ticket was 1,500. I was going to say pounds, but it's $1,500, which effectively is not the same thing. They're probably worth more. But let's say £1,500. That is more often than not an entry-level person's salary. So that conference in America is saying, we want you to attend and pay your entire month's
salary
to attend. You've got to then justify that to your landlord, for example, or your company or your employer. And often, we know this, I'm not about to say anything that neither of us or none of the listeners or viewers will know. Junior level roles have a very short lifespan, 18, 24 months tops. You're asking a company to invest what they would pay you for 1 month, so give you 2 months' salary in 1 month, to send you to a conference, knowing that you're very likely going to learn more, get more skills, and eventually want to better yourself and move elsewhere for a different salary. You're basically saying, pay for me to become better and leave, which is not going to happen. So I think there's a disconnect between the UK and the US, and I think it needs addressing. I don't know why US events cost so much. Well, cost is subjective, but for me, it costs a lot. But in the same way, independently, they're operating very well together. And I'm not in the conference organizing space, but having done a lot of conference talks and been at a lot of conferences and speaking to a lot of organizers, I can see where the costs are involved. Electricity in the US is the same electricity that we get in the UK. We just pay more for it, for example.
Yeah.
But it's a straight. It's hard to sort of qualify.
In terms of the conferences, something I've noticed, especially with International Women's Day recently passed, was conferences wanting to be more diverse, but not wanting to pay the speakers. And it baffles me, especially the ones based in London, where the ticket price is up there. And I'm just like, I know I'm not an accountant, I know I'm not a conference planner, but I feel like you have some budget, especially when I see they have top notch, not to name and shame, but I know Gary Vaynerchuk and Steve Bartlett aren't speaking for free. So you planned their budget, but you want these people, like, in regards to any aspiring public speakers in the marketing sector, is there anything you would say, tips to negotiate that? Have you had to negotiate that? Not to get in your business, you can decline to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll very quickly say that I was asked to speak at an event where there was a very popular person speaking. And then we were having a conversation about it. This is when I was very new to this. We were having a conversation about me speaking there. And then towards the end, when we're about to seal the deal, they basically said, right, so your fee is going to be £7,500. And I was like, whoa. But then that's what I would have had to pay them to speak. And I was like, right, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But to answer your question, the very, very first thing to do is simply ask, simply ask, what is your honorarium? What is your speaker package? What package is available? I always make a point of asking two questions: whether it's an event that I've pitched for, or whether it's an event that's gone out of their way to ask me to give a talk there. I always say, what's the speaker package, and what does your lineup look like? It's a polite way of saying, are you choosing one person of color to be at the event? So there's an event that I'm doing later this year, for example, where I'm not being paid to do it, but They are looking after all of the speakers, for example, by putting everybody up in a hotel, taking them out for dinner. And they've made a very huge point to say, look, we've hired out a huge venue. There's going to be hundreds, if not more than four-figure number of people there. This is what the tickets will cost. And they've already said whatever money they make on top of their fees for the day will go straight to a charity who are going to be the main sponsor of the day. And I was like, I'm absolutely fine with that, because they're not lining their own pockets, but profit off the back of myself and however many other speakers' knowledge they've got. So they said, we don't pay our speakers as a rule, because anything we make on profit goes to a charity. Great. But I've digressed a bit there. Always ask, what's your speaker package? And if there isn't one, there's got to be a trade-off. For example, will they, if you live 300 miles, for example, from where the conference is, are you then expected to travel off your own back, organize your own travel, train, bus, boat, fly, walk, whatever? And then if it's 300 miles or more away, in that case, you're probably not going to go on the day, because most conferences start at 9 o'clock. So you're going to have to give up time and money. So it's always important to ask what's available, what's on offer, whether you've pitched for that conference or whether the conference has reached out to you. And secondly, I always ask, what's the lineup of the event? I always make sure that I ask, and I don't think not many people do it. Typically, organizers won't say, well, we've got Joe, Jane, Tim, Tommy, Sally, whatever. They won't name names, but they will say, we've got 30 speakers. Of that, certain amount of percentage are people of color. We've got a male female split of this amount. It makes me feel more comfortable knowing that I'm going firstly into a space where that's considered, but secondly, and probably more importantly, I'm going into a space where I'm not going to be feeling like the only person from a marginalized group there. I'm going into a space where I know my people
effort
will be there, and like you said, that they've made an effort. So my advice there would be to always ask. The absolute worst thing that can happen if you ask is they say, we don't have a budget, we can't pay for you. But it would be remiss of me not to end this answer by saying, very good friend of mine, Arija Wali, she's very, very well known in the SEO industry. She has set the absolute blueprint for events. She's created a space for women only. It's called Women in Tech SEO. You should check it out. She runs an event once a year. She's literally just run one. She makes a point of paying all of her speakers. She does it in London. I think the last one was at the Barbican. So very well-known places in the capital city of the UK. The ticket prices, I'm not going to misquote them, but they are very, very reasonable. You're not going to pay £700-800 for this event. They are affordable for every level of seniority within a business. On top of that, she offers scholarship tickets. So she tells businesses, you can pay for a ticket with someone from an underrepresented group to come and attend this event. But she looks after her speakers. She'll pay them, take them out for dinner and stuff. And I think more conferences should do that. She's charged an absolute fraction of what some of the bigger, more established events in the industry are doing. And I genuinely mean a fraction of what they're doing, yet is still able to pay speakers. It doesn't matter if you're a speaker. For example, there might have been a woman speaking there who's probably got, I don't know, a year's worth of experience in marketing, or has, I'm making a point of not saying only, or has 30 followers or 300. She genuinely doesn't care about the number of followers, like your social score or index. All she cares about is, are you going to provide value to the community that she's built? I think it's over 5,000 people now.
It's huge. And I absolutely, that was one of the three people I love when it comes to tech SEO. She inspired the speaker database that I built for the Southwest. Like, I saw her Women in Tech speak, and I'm just like, I love this, because a lot of the time, especially when there are groups that are creating spaces for marginalized individuals, women, people of color, disabled people, a lot of the time, the only way they can get money from corporates is by charging corporates for access to those individuals. And everything that she's done has made it sustainable, as far as I know, from the outside, but also allowing people to see the women that she's backing and highlighting and profiling them as well, without having to do that bit. Not saying that that's a bad thing. It just tends to be the way the model is. Running communities and building communities is a lot of work. It's hard work. And a lot of the times, depending on the community, you can't always charge the individuals, and you're charging corporates.
Yeah.
So a bit of inspiration. I need to go to one. I know I'm gonna sit there and I'm gonna be like, what?
No, she's absolutely brilliant. And I think on that point, like, we, depending on when this goes out, excuse me, depending on when this goes out, we very recently had International Women's Day.
Mhm.
And I deliberately well, it was yesterday, I've said it now, sorry. I deliberately didn't make a specific social post about it. Like, it's International Women's Day, here are 5 women who I admire, etc. I just think a lot of it is for vanity, because, like, literally today, the day after International Women's Day, I was talking to a friend of mine in the industry, female, runs an organization, runs stuff, is looking for sponsorship. The company that she was talking to for sponsorship basically said, well, we can't pay you, but we can give you, like,
Exposure.
yeah, we can put your image, your logo on our website. And I'm thinking, I bet she didn't tell me, but if I know who that organization was, and if I were to look on their website or their socials, there will probably be like an IWD post. We want to celebrate all the women today. And I'm going to, in the talk that I'm doing in a few weeks' time, so for context, the talk is about equality and how you can align that with digital marketing. Part of it, I make a nod to the gender pay gap app, the bot.
The bot, yes, love the bot.
Fantastic, absolutely fantastic, because it literally puts everybody on blast, whether you're doing really good things or whether you're doing really bad. It's at the point now where you will be on blast within seconds. And I just think you can't, it's just tokenism, ticking a box, call it what you want. It just...
So this is absolutely perfect, because this is coming out the week after I had my mini rant. So this year for International Women's Day, I went on a strike, a fake strike, but I was just like, the theme is equity, and me speaking for free is not equitable. Not saying that anyone who asked me to speak, I assumed. I just was just saying no and passing opportunities elsewhere. But I was also, just something was rubbing me wrong about it this year. And I don't know if it's because I'm feeling people fade away from the whole awareness they had in 2020 around Black Lives Matter. And I'm just starting to get really cynical. But in that podcast episode, I shared about my whole theory of spotlight, saturation, and normalization. So I feel like when International Women's Day started, the spotlight, and I feel like people putting intent into their content around the theme, and we're relating it. And now we're getting to the saturation phase where everyone's just chucking stuff out. And even with the bot is one of the, I think, the best opportunities to be transparent with your brand values. And people are just not responding to it. I'm just like, if I got tweeted by the bot, no matter what my gap is, if my gap was like 1,000%, I'd be like, these are our initiatives we're working towards. We still want to spotlight the people in our community we think represent. Like, I would say, and they're letting the bot tweet them, and some of them are deleting their tweets, which I think is a cop-out as well.
Yeah, and they're getting, well, let's call it what it is, they're getting absolutely peppered for it. The worst one that I saw yesterday was Wizz Air, the airline. Standard stock image of a group of men and women stood in front of an airline, but the gap was something like, I don't know, it was huge. The gap between men and women was huge, and the worst part about it was the gap had got wider in the past year.
I saw a few of those.
So they deleted the tweet, but I went onto Wizz Air's page on Twitter. Everything they've put out since, people are just throwing that tweet back in there. So no matter what you do, the internet doesn't forget.
The internet does not forget, and
it will come. It will come for you. But like you said, to own it in that way is much, much better. It's something that I've spoke about a huge amount of time. I literally said, what did I say? This is what I said: executive bonuses, leadership bonuses should be tied to your DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. You say on day one of year one that by day 365, we're going to achieve this, and in year two, we're going to achieve this. If you don't, you shouldn't get a bonus. Same way people
Agree.
get bonus for profit growth or whatever, reducing certain lines on your P&L, that should be potentially one of those things that you think, right, well, I'm not going to get a bonus because I'm not doing that. Literally, I could talk your head off about some of this stuff. I was just like,
There's
it's
so many
frustration.
things,
It's a
but
frustration. The biggest thing I
you
want to mention, I'm not going to end
Mhm.
this recording without saying this. The biggest thing I want to mention, you've heard me talk about this before. We do not talk about the fact that we don't link up certain characteristics together. We talk about the
intersectionality.
gender pay gap. We talk about, okay, women are paid less than men. We talk about the fact separately, like, for example, I know that in London there's a 20% unadjusted ethnicity pay gap. So we do not talk about those two facts together. I always say, right, women are paid less. And as an example, black people are paid less than their white counterparts. Nobody ever puts those two together, I've certainly seen, and says, well, what if you're a black woman?
Hmm.
You're going to be penalized for being black financially, and you're also going to be penalized for your gender. So somebody who identifies as a black woman will be almost double penalized for absolutely no logical reason. And we don't talk about that. I would love to see like a future version of the gender pay gap app as a race pay gap.
Hmm.
I
I
would love to see
think
that.
there was talks of it reported. Obviously, this is not a political podcast, so don't take any of this fact. There was talks of them implementing one, but the companies apparently didn't have the data to even know what the gap is, which is a whole other thing. Um, but the intersectionality and I again, I'm cynical to all of this. I've been in this world too long, so it's funny to me. I'm just saying that to be like, I'm about to say a terrible thing. But sometimes when I talk to some clients that I'm training, when I talk about, hey, you can represent a dark-skinned black woman, they're like, huh? It the
Mhm.
and when I show them examples like within stock photography, when they're searching women, I'm like, you realize all the women that come up are white. They're like, oh, I never noticed that.
Mhm.
And I'm like, so what do you do when you want to represent black and brown people? And they either go to a specific stock photo data set, like the Black UK Black Tech, which is an amazing stock photo data set, but they will still pick the man. And I'm
Mhm.
just like, so you just skip past, you don't even continue. Your target audience is women. You have an opportunity to make it intersectional, but it was too hard. So you skip past it altogether
Mhm.
and tick one of the boxes rather than it's interesting. However, we can talk about so many things for so long. Um, I want to know, we're just talking about International Women's Day's campaign. It doesn't have to be a campaign around that, but do you have a campaign that you've seen either recently or in the past that was inclusive, good, or inclusive, bad? Um, Pops to mind. We will link it if there's a video or anything, we'll link it in the description.
Okay. Apologies if this one has been used before in a previous episode, but when I was doing some research for a campaign for this talk that I'm giving, I came across the Dove hashtag Show Us campaign, which you've probably seen or heard about. Literally, I was like, this is exactly the sort of campaign that I want. And I don't know if it's ever been dug into or sort of dived into in any depth, but it's like literally, for those who don't know, it's a women-led campaign. It focuses on proper diversity in all formats. And with this campaign, the images, there were not any digital assets. So the images from this campaign that I've seen sort of blew up all over social media over the past few years. The images that I've seen, for example, women who were slightly larger, so not like a very slim young blonde woman. People who I can't think of the right language to say it. So, for example, there were Muslim women in headscarves. There were women who suffer with dwarfism. I'm not sure if that's the right term. I'm very sorry if that's the wrong one. People of different colours, models with, I think it was vitiligo, literally everything. Immediately, I thought, I'm going to look at this campaign and I'm going to look at it in the eyes of someone who is, or try to look at it through the eyes of someone who doesn't care about this stuff. And what would they say upon looking at this? And I put it in my slide deck. Great, wonderful, love to see it. Did it work? What's the point of it? Did it work?
Mm.
I looked into brand value of Dove. Shout out to Statista for for having some of this information. Since that project has come out, the brand value, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's skyrocketed. Now, it might not be as a direct result of that campaign, but the fact that Dove are reaching out to and including the audience that they are speaking to, I don't think that's a coincidence at all. If the brand value had completely nosedived, the first thing that everybody, including Dove, would probably blame is that campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it's skyrocketed, people are not like putting two and two together. Dove on its own is a very strong brand. I could give you a soap bar in a certain shape and you wouldn't know it's a Dove one because that's
Mm-hmm.
what the brand is. But the fact they're considering this and they're doing this shows that is incredibly inclusive marketing. It is probably one of the most popular ones. But yeah, I was looking at this and I thought I'll dive into the numbers, and I was like, that's incredible. I made a point of looking out at some of the images and I was like, if I didn't know, this is me from my own lens now,
Mm-hmm.
if I didn't know that this was a campaign specifically targeted like for women and being diverse and focusing on every different group of society, I would simply think this is a great ad for Dove. I wouldn't put two and two together and think, right, this is a focus on diversity in all sorts of aspects, body shape, cultural backgrounds, religion. I'm just seeing women advertising product and thinking great. But the wider point, did it work? Absolutely, brand value through the roof.
Dove is one of our faves. I want to do a case study on them. They have a good recovery. Like in terms of when we look at examples of fuck ups, Dove is one of the ones that started a bit shaky. The reason it was on our radar is because they had some campaigns that weren't great, that were very bad, but their recovery has been consistent.
Yeah.
This one was on our list, but more so because I think they made the images public as stock photos.
Yeah.
And what I love about it is practical. Like, yes, it's a campaign. Yes, it's promoting their brand values, but at the same time, it's giving their marketing team stock photo resource. It and it's just like, okay, here, this is what we have. It's engaging with their audience, and then all the women who they've included, models or so forth, are now advocates for Dove. And they've now got another campaign where they're talking about what does professional hair look like in relation to Black women, and the fact that they've continued and they're still practical. I think sometimes, and this is what I asked you about the whole inclusive marketing and exclusion earlier on. Sometimes when people focus on inclusive marketing, they focus solely on doing it for the good and forget the marketing and the practicality of it. I love when I see stuff like this one that the project show us, because there's so much practicality aligned with everything else.
Yeah.
And the longevity in that is beautiful, because people will, there'll be a point where people, just like you said, use these photos and not know where it originated from.
Yeah.
And it's stamping within history. I love it. I love that one.
It's for the wider good, right? And just, I mean, just to add on to what you said, you made a perfect point earlier about intent. You can tell from the outside that the intent with that campaign was genuine, wasn't forced, not doing it to tick a box or whatever. It's genuine intent to serve the audience that it wants to speak to. And I think that's important. I've made a very similar point in the past. We talked about International Women's Day. The intention behind a huge amount of those posts was not to recognize and uplift women. It was purely for social media engagement, in my opinion. Feel free, if you're listening or watching, to disagree, but I would challenge you to find any one of those brands with a large gender pay gap and tell me that on their, let's pick a random date, I don't know, August the 4th last year, what they did to uplift women. And I bet you
Because
can't.
August the 4th was hashtag cookie month. They can't do another, they can't hashtag it on another day. Come on.
But
Oh,
yeah, no,
God.
the point remains. I think intent is absolutely key, and I'll round off by saying this. I very briefly mentioned there that Dove has got a very, very strong brand. I could give you a bar of soap in a certain shape, you wouldn't know it was Dove, or a shampoo bottle, something that I'm not familiar with, by the way. But give you a certain product, you wouldn't know it's Dove. You do not have to have a strong brand to do inclusive marketing. For me, that's a misconception, which I think this podcast and hopefully other episodes that you do will shatter that misconception. You could sell something like industrial tank parts
Hmm.
and do inclusive marketing. Simple as.
I was challenged on that recently. I was just like, so we have a scenario we play when we're building the platform, the software, where it's like, what's the worst case scenario? Worst case scenario, some bad person could make a really inclusive campaign. And at the end of the day, inclusion comes in various ways when you think of marketing. It's the language, it's the representation, it's the strategies, all those things. But if they still wanted to do something bad, inclusive marketing is not going to stop that. Like with International Women's Day, they could have had amazing copy, they could have had the most representative pictures and all that stuff, but the company did jack shit. So they don't always, ideally in that Dove case, it aligns and you want it to align, and the marketing should always align with the company values and the company's mission and so forth. Sometimes it doesn't. Not saying that anyone listening has a bad company, but I'm just
No, but there like yesterday, for example, International Women's Day, there's a huge opportunity there for people with genuine intent to turn something around. I would scour that hashtag. I wish I could remember the woman's name, but I can't. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a post from a woman, not a brand, a woman. She was a firefighter in her firefighter's gear, holding her two children. I don't know if you saw this, but she basically said words to the effect of, I've been a firefighter for 12 years now. When I told my partner at the time, on the day that I got accepted, he had me in a chokehold. Do we need International Women's Day? Yes, we do. And I'm pretty sure that one of her two children was a young girl. I saw that and I was incredibly moved by it. I was like, that is incredible, because firefighting traditionally is seen as a male-dominated industry. If I have anybody who works in that industry who does marketing in any form, I would reach out to that woman and I would say, this is absolutely fantastic. It's genuine. The intention is great. I would love to do a campaign with you and give you the spotlight. Not because we want social engagement, because we think posts like yours in that authentic tone could potentially lead to more women thinking that there's a career in firefighting for them in a heavily male-dominated industry. Stuff like that. There are opportunities there which I don't think people look for. It's more how many likes, shares, what impressions are we getting? And I think that's probably a problem with the marketing industry.
There's many problems. We're working to things. There's many problems. I want to have you back on the podcast to chat AI, because we haven't had that chat. Because as soon as you said problems, I'm just like, ooh, there's a mini storm brewing. There's a mini storm brewing, and absolutely. I would love your SEO perspective on it as well. Because
I've got thoughts on that. I saw literally one today from a woman in India who's harmed herself massively. Journalist. I would never do it. She'd used AI to write an article about something which clearly she hasn't got an expert opinion on, nor is an expert herself, but quite clearly left the prompt from ChatGPT in the article. And I'm like, no.
Okay.
We'll talk about it another time.
That's a whole other journey. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Let the listeners and viewers know where they can find you.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I am on Twitter at Azeem Digital. I'm on LinkedIn /Azeem A1. If you can find me that way. If my SEO is any good, you should be able to type in, how can I contact Azeem? And I should have the featured snippet there. I'm in an ongoing battle with a small jewelers in London who share the same name as me for that top spot. But ask Google, how can you contact me? And if I'm not number one, I should be number two. If you click it, it will help me to get to number one.
Top number two, I love it. Quoting Beyonce, I love the way, perfect way to end the podcast. We'll also put all those links in the description, in the transcription. Thank you so much for joining me on the Marketing Made Inclusive podcast. Please, if you are listening, you can watch us on YouTube and see Azeem's beautiful face, and follow us anywhere on the internet. Have a lovely day.